And the transition, I think, looks better, the transition period in the future looks actually better for the independents than for the majors. I think you, earlier in your careers, and I, towards the end of my career, can look forward to changes that are going to help the independent. First and foremost is the movement away from film to first tape, now high definition, and I can get into that a little bit later. This allows us to make films of sometimes greater quality, less expensively, and more efficiently. Particularly the lighter cameras enable us to work on natural locations, so the studio becomes not unnecessary, but less necessary. For instance, I had a studio. I had two studios, one in Ireland for reasons the Irish government was financing me, and one in Venice, California, as Michael said, which is right next to Santa Monica. I know the area in Santa Monica that he referred to very well. I had that studio for about 15 years, and I sold it a few years ago as I realized with the newer equipment, it isn't just the cameras, the lighting equipment, the sound equipment, all of this has become lighter, more portable, and I felt I didn't need the studio anymore. So I sold the studio to a real estate developer and am now shooting everything on natural locations, which is the way I started, but you can do it better today than you could then. Another thing that bodes well for the independent is the fact that there are so many of these blockbusters coming out that one follows another, and the audience has shown in the last couple of years they have a slightly diminished interest in them. They're still doing well, but not quite as well as a couple of years ago. You can just see a slight drop. And what is coming up is more or less the niche picture, or what used to be called the auteur film. When I had my theatrical distribution company, I was distributing foreign films, films of Bergman, Fellini, Truffaut, Kurosawa, directors like that. And what we're seeing now is independent American producers and directors are making films maybe not quite on that level of artistic expertise or creative expertise, but they're making good independent films that are starting to play not so much in the major circuits, but surprisingly in the type of theaters that we used to call art theaters when we were dealing with Bergman and Fellini and so forth. This is a major opportunity for the independents to reach the type of audience that is becoming a little bit tired of, as I think it was Michael who talked about Batman 8 or whatever, wherever it's going. So I see a slight resurgence of interest in the more individual and creative type of independent films. That combined with the lighter, better equipment really does give us an opportunity. I might mention just one more thing in this area, and then I'll throw it open for questions. I found in the past that the audience is more interested in the questions than what I have to say. But there's a book out, there's a book out called The Long Tail, and it's talking about the differences the internet is making in selling. They're not talking about motion pictures, they're talking about industry in general. And you can think of, I think of motion pictures as a combination of an art form and an industry. And The Long Tail says, for instance, and they gave an example in the selling of books for bookstores, and you can just take that example and put it straight into motion pictures. There's a finite amount of space in a bookstore. So the bookstore will put on its shelves primarily the books that are the best sellers of the day, but there are many other books that could sell if they had shelf space, but there is no shelf space and they barely sell at all. What the book states is that the internet essentially replaces, to a large extent, the bookstore. And the internet has almost infinite shelf space. So the long tail, if you were to draw a graph of the sales of the best sellers coming up like this, and then the other books would come down like this in the sale at a bookstore, finds now there's a long tail on selling books over the internet because they're no longer limited by the shelf space. So if for interest, for let us say there was, being an engineer, if somebody had written a book saying analyzing the uses of arches in building Roman aqueducts, there would be no space for that on that book in a bookstore, and would hardly sell and might not even be published. But on the internet, the tale goes on forever, and those few people who might be interested in how Roman arches were designed would be able to buy that book. And you can carry that analogy directly forward to motion pictures and say that there is now an increased market for independent films and unusual films that could not find space in theaters or even find space in Blockbuster or Tower Records or whatever. They now, however, have space on the internet, and that is the final point that I would make to say that although the independents the last 10 years have been in some difficulty, we're now seeing, I think, an increased opportunity. So I think it's easy to say the great days were behind us. It's just as easy and possibly more correct to say that the great days are in front of us. Now, if anybody would have any question or any comment or anything, I'd be happy to answer.
You said you were going to talk about high definition?
Yes. Now here's a situation. First question has to be that. Unfortunately, I spent 45 years learning how to work with film. I feel I know about as much about film other than people who work in laboratories. And what is coming in is, of course, high definition, of which I know less. But I know enough about it to talk a little bit. High definition, I think, is the wave of the future. It's come up in a number of ways. For instance, I was giving a talk somewhere, and again, one of the first questions was about high def, and we were talking about cameras. And I said, if somebody had come to me a few years ago and asked about cameras, actually they wouldn't even have asked about cameras. Everybody knew there were only 3 or 4 standard makes, Aeroflex, Panaflex, Panavision, and earlier on the Mitchells and so forth, and you didn't even think about it. They were all good cameras, and whatever camera you had available you took. With coming in, shooting on tape and now on high def, the choice of the camera is very, very important, because it's very easy to take a very inexpensive camera and shoot your picture, and you are going to damage your picture because the quality of the camera has become increasingly important. As I said, if you had a choice between Aeroflex and Panaflex for a film camera, it made no particular difference. You were going to get essentially the same image on the film. But your choice of camera now becomes very, very important. And I'm talking in an area of which my knowledge is limited. But for instance, I've been shooting with the Sony Cinealta high-def camera, which is a very good camera. And therefore, I get more pixels, more bits, whatever you want to call it, images on the screen, so I get a clearer, sharper, more defined picture.